Good evening and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Dialogue-Based Education, a History and Applications in the Classroom. And my name is Andy Mink, and I'm pleased to be able to join you tonight as the Vice President for Education at the National Humanities Center. And joining me from Bakersfield, California is my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael D. Burrows, who is not only the director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics, as well as an assistant professor of philosophy at CSU Bakersfield, but also a president of Plato, the philosophy learning and teaching organization. Plato is a co-sponsor of tonight's session, and the National Humanities Center is very pleased to be able to work with Plato both this year and in years past to be able to share the expertise that we have in both of our institutions, but also to be able to combine our work and bring it to you teachers. I invite you to look at Michael's slim biography there and notice that one of the real credibilities he has there is classroom teacher. And as we all know, as all of you know who probably have just dismissed your classes, or maybe you're back home and decompressing from the day, that having that kind of lens, having that kind of perspective is really critical in the kinds of conversations that we're going to have and the work that you do. Tonight's webinar is an audio and PowerPoint based webinar. You'll hear my voice, you'll hear Michael's voice, and while he's presenting, I'll be asking questions and I'll be inserting comments, giving him a little bit of feedback on what he's saying. But the most important actor in this webinar will be you, the audience. And I'd invite you to look now at the Go to Training control panel that you have open. And all the way down at the bottom is the chat box. That chat box is a place where you can register questions, you can respond to some of the things that we're saying. I think tonight's session will be pretty interactive. And so there'll be a lot of sort of open-ended times for you to give us your feedback and your experiences and your thoughts. It's also a place you can connect with each other, and I would encourage you to do so. Usually we make the PowerPoint available for our participants after the session is completed. As all of you know and likely do in your own classroom, it's nice to sort of be able to guide the conversation in real time and then give you the work afterwards. Tonight, though, we did make the PowerPoint available in the webinar landing page that you have access to. It's got the readings, it's got the other various materials that have been provided you by the scholar. In this case, we have also added the PowerPoint in advance because of the content that we're working with, because of the way that we're going to go about this, you might want to make some notes. So you might want to have access to that sort of on the side or in another monitor screen that's open. So during my introduction, you're welcome to go and download that or have access to it, but you might go ahead and check that out now. The National Humanities Center is entering our 41st year of supporting humanities scholarship and education. In terms of scholarship, we have an annual cohort of fellows who come and spend their time in Durham between Labor Day and Memorial Day. We accept applications every late summer, early fall, and make selections for the following year. And if selected, those university professors get a full sabbatical from their home schools. They get full, sort of a break from all of their other duties and responsibilities, and they get to come and just do their good work. That work often includes writing books, it includes doing research, it includes having conversations with each other and seeing connections between different themes and disciplines. It's really intended to be a think tank, a place where the best humanities research and scholarship can be born. The education department then is intended to build bridges from that world to the world of the classroom. And it's very important for us to be able to add content knowledge, to be able to add a deeper understanding of the issues that we're facing as a society, as a citizenry, and offer that the humanities are important tools to do that. I think this notion of civic discourse, this notion of asking kids to be critical thinkers, of creating classroom environments that are based on inquiry and questioning, all play into the real skill sets that you'll see modeled in the humanities and through the different work of our scholars and the fellows and the academics that we work with. Inside of all that then becomes advocacy for the humanities. This is not extra stuff, it's not luxury, it's not something you do when everything else is completed and math class is passed. The humanities are extremely important tools for understanding our role in the community we live in. And I would invite you to visit our website and to spend some time sort of seeing the work that has transpired and has come out of the center. Our education work then through these bridges is designed to give you teachers access to that through a variety of means, and and deliverables. Some of those are classroom-ready lessons or instructional materials. Others are collections of primary sources and source work. Third collection might be essays that scholars have written to help make sense of these things. All of our work, of course, is free and open, and I invite you to come and download it and use it as you please with the students that you work with. Our webinar series has increasingly become a place where we can spend 75 to 90 minutes really discussing and talking about how to bring these understandings to students of younger ages. It's important for us to identify topics that not only are in your curriculum, and I hope as you look through our webinar series, there are some topics that you teach on a regular basis, and it's always good to sort of support the knowledge you have of those things. But I think you'll also find that a lot of the topics are extracurricular. That is, they deal with the issues that we're facing today that are all of our students, all of us are talking about on a regular basis. We're asking questions about, we're curious about. And these webinars are intended to give all of us a chance to just talk through and better understand what these things might be. Our registration for the spring series opens next week, November 14th, and I would encourage you to put that on your iCal and make yourself a little alert. We've been fortunate to be able to reach capacity at our webinars at a pretty regular clip, including tonight's session, which is sold out at 200. We do limit the attendance at 200 so we can maintain that sort of conversational tone of our webinars. But next week we will open these up and you'll be able to sign up for free, as many as you like. I think you can also expect a new document that we've produced that will help you track your selections and the credit that you can share with your school administration. So we're going to be sending that out as part of the download, and you'll be able to see exactly how to keep track of all the credit that you've received for attending these sessions. I think you'll find that next spring sessions are provocative, they're compelling, and again, they really offer a unique lens to understanding many of the issues and the topics that are on all of our minds. And I'm saying that, of course, with the two examples on the screen right now. The one I'm one I'm very interested in is working with Sarah Igo from Vanderbilt on the modern notion of privacy in the digital age, and really how we've become documentarians of our own world, and how that's perhaps changed how we think of ourselves and the cultural identity we have. I know as a parent and as an educator, that's a really provocative topic that I'm looking forward to spending time in. We have lots of other content that you can download and access for free. That includes a podcast series in which we have scholars and teachers discussing different kinds of topics and thoughts in education and in teaching. We've got digital textbooks that are located on iTunes. You can download these and make them available to your students either as a whole, as a compilation, or in sort of bite-sized chunks. If you look at the table of contents that I've got in screenshot, you'll see that one of those is philosophy. And I'm pleased to say that Michael Burrows, our guest speaker tonight, was instrumental in designing that chapter with his colleague Allison Cohen from Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia. And then finally, we are also creating a new catalog of online courses. This gives you a chance not just to have a conversation, but to spend an immersive amount of time around a topic. Our first course, Digital Literacy in the Classroom, sold out in both instances this fall. In the spring, we'll be opening 3 new courses right after the holidays, and then by next August, beginning of next academic year, we should have about 8 or 10 different titles that will be in a catalog format, and you can sign up and choose to be a part of those. So please keep an eye on our website and our social media so you can get a sense of that. All of the work that I'm describing is not done in isolation. We work hard to connect with and create relationships with schools and teachers around the country. That primarily is represented by our Teacher Advisory Council. This year we have 15 talented, wonderful educators from all over the country who help us make sure that we're relevant, help us really be sure that the work we're doing is applicable to the classroom. We want to make sure that all this content is good, solid content for you as adults. And then the idea is that you can translate that for your elementary, your middle, your high school classroom, or your community college or university teaching environment. But really the secret ingredient, the key piece here, is the content and the sources that go with that. So that's my quick introduction. I want to remind you that at the end of tonight's webinar, you'll have a chance to complete a short survey. And once that's completed, you will receive a certificate for your participation. That certificate will document the hours you've spent with us. And again, you can turn that into your teaching portfolio and you can make sure that your administration knows that you did this good work with us. I say all that as an introduction to the center, and as an introduction to Michael and the topic tonight. I'm frequently struck by just how important conversation has become. It may be the superpower that we really need in this country we live in. Being able to have civic discourse, being able to have dialogue, being able to listen and to hear, being able to unpack, complicated things through questions and through through active listening and dialogue is so critically important. And it strikes me that philosophy might be one of those disciplines that gives us a piece of that superpower. And so, Michael, I'm super pleased that you can join us from California and lead tonight's session. I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit more about your background and in particular Plato, but first let me just welcome you. Hey, Michael, can you hear me in California?
Yes, I can hear you, Andy. And let me just start by saying thanks so much to Andy and the National Humanities Center for having me, and also having spent some time at the National Humanities Center and worked with Andy and his team. It's just amazing the work you're doing. I think everybody can tell that from the webinars you're seeing. There's about, I think pretty much everyone up there that you had up there, I'd like to take myself. So thanks so much for your work, and welcome to everybody. I've been watching, people are popping in and coming in from around the country and actually around the globe. There's a couple international folks too. So thanks so much for taking time to be with me tonight. I really appreciate it. So just to move ahead a bit and talk about Plato, just to start, and I talk about this both because, Plato is a passion project of mine, but also relevant to our discussion tonight and some of your work. I know many of you are classroom teachers. So the Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization was founded in 2010. And we are basically the largest national nonprofit that focuses on supporting philosophy classes for all K through 12 students, including in those classrooms least likely to have access to to philosophy classes and broader humanities-based academic enrichment programs. Our website is listed there. We have a possibility for joining us as a member, and there's certain benefits that come through membership, but we also offer just a lot of free resources on our website. And I have this under selected resources here. The Philosopher's Toolkit, which is a wide range of philosophically informed lesson plans for use in K through 12 classrooms. We run biennial conferences and workshops for teachers. We sponsor the High School Ethics Bowl, which many of you might have heard of, but it's basically a now national debate competition that focuses on ethics and ethical reasoning. And we also provide downloadable resources to help you start a philosophy outreach or philosophy in schools program if you're interested in doing that, as well as 2 journals that questions actually is much of the content from questions actually comes from students in philosophy classes, both in middle and high school and even elementary school. And Pre-College Philosophy and Public Practice is a new journal that's on peer-reviewed scholarship on pre-college philosophy and public forms of philosophy broadly construed. The last thing I want to say there is just that, we have, as I mentioned, conferences. Our next conference is in 2019, June 21st, 22nd at Rollins College, Florida. So proposal submissions are due for that December 1st. And the conference, of course, I'm biased. I'm president of the organization, but I can say from past experience, it's always a mixture of faculty, K through 12 teachers, undergraduate and graduate students. It's a real diverse mix. And I always get great ideas. It's a great community. And so that's coming up. Just so you know, too, those of you, I see many of you from LA, our 2020 conference is going to be at UC San Diego in June 2020. So that's one just to keep on your radar. It's going to be our 10th anniversary, and it's going to be a lot of exciting things happening around there. So just inviting you to engage with the site and engage with the organization if it's of interest.
Hey, Michael, let me, if you don't mind, I'm going to interrupt you just briefly.
Sure.
And if I'm going to ask you a question that I think is a little bit of an elephant in the room based on what you've just shared and where I think this might go tonight. And I'm just going to point at it immediately. And that is, I've used it. I've heard you now use it several times, and that is this phrase K-12. And I know that it's a sort of a filler term. We use K-12 to mean pre-college, but I want you to affirm for us that the work that you're discussing and we will do tonight and maybe are available at this conference, but you are talking about literally K-12, elementary level students, middle grade students. And, the elephant would be, really, Michael? young
Yeah.
kids can do philosophy? Tell me in your experience how that's been so powerful.
Right. So thanks for the question. And I think sometimes I take that for granted. So actually, my as a classroom teacher before I went to grad school and embarked on this aspect of my career now. I was actually a high school teacher, but and I taught philosophy in high school for 4 years, two different schools. But actually, since that time, my research specialization has actually been on doing philosophy with really the youngest kids. So actually, preschool and kindergarten classrooms. And sometimes people are skeptical about that. But actually, when we get to the latter part of this presentation, you'll see plenty of examples of how to do this work with young kids. But I think, the one way I'll phrase it is, so now I teach plenty of university classes as well. And I think one of the things that's amazing about working with young kids, particularly around philosophical themes, is the real, virtue that children have as philosophers is the ability to wonder and the ability to question. And that's really fundamentally what philosophy is about. So last week I was facilitating a philosophy session with third graders. We were reading a work of children's literature called The Big Orange Blot. And what's always amazing to me is actually, children have so many questions and ideas and are so interested in discussing ideas just for the sake of discussing them. And oftentimes when you work with older students, those can be fantastic sessions too, but you actually have to do a lot of work to get them to be willing to question and engage on that deeper level. And I think, so just to say, I think children actually have a lot of natural capacities as philosophers. And part of our job is to help facilitate those conversations and help use those conversations to build in reasoning, critical thinking, and questioning skill sets. But I think there's a lot of strength actually in early childhood. And I'll try and show that later in the presentation as well.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So just to continue on, let's see, there we go. So I'm gonna go back one here, actually. Yeah. So let me just talk a bit about the outline for the webinar tonight. I want to do kind of two main things in this webinar, and the first is going to be doing a little bit of work in some theory, and I want to give us a kind of philosophy and ethics of education as it relates to dialogue. So basically, working with John Dewey, one of his key texts, and Paulo Freire, one of his key texts, kind of give us some conceptual resources for us to be able to think about, what makes for a valuable educational experience and what role dialogue might play in valuable educational experience, and kind of set some of those foundations for us. And then following that, I want to go to some concrete applications in the classroom. And how do we stimulate and structure dialogue in our classrooms? I want to get your ideas on that, given all of your expertise as teachers and thinkers about this. And I'm going to use kind of, for examples there, children's literature and things I'm calling vignettes, and I'll explain that in a bit. But I want you to know, kind of going into this, some of you, maybe you think, well, I teach high school, or I teach college, or I teach early childhood. Even the examples that are focused on early childhood or middle school, or or elementary school, they're really eminently adaptable. And I can say, I've literally taught every grade level, K through 12 all the way through university. And oftentimes the ideas that I use to great effect in my university classrooms can't come from working with younger kids, like ways to make an idea creative and engaging and adaptable for a classroom. So just want to note that too. I think there's a lot of room to use these and adapt them to your own practice. So that's what we'll do tonight.
And it sounds, Michael, too, that that adaptability also goes horizontally through discipline. So there's lots of different things. You don't necessarily have to be teaching a philosophy class to incorporate many of the strategies that you're discussing.
Definitely not, and it's a great point you're raising. I think I recognize just as much as anyone who's been a classroom teacher and works in schools regularly, as I still do, how busy teachers are and how many demands are placed on teachers. And the great thing about what we're talking about tonight is the things that can be applied to really any kind of lesson. It's kind of just a shift in tone and a shift in perspective, not a here's a new curriculum to introduce or only this classroom will work. It's really a strategy that you can use and adapt across the curriculum.
Thank you.
Let's go on to the next slide here. Here we go. So starting with John Dewey. So John Dewey, many of you might know some of his work. Some of you may have not engaged with him as closely. Probably the most preeminent philosopher of education, or certainly one of the most preeminent philosophers of education in the Western tradition. numerous works on education. I have several of them listed here. Our focus tonight is, and the readings I provided come from Dewey's last and most mature work on education, called Experience in Education. And a couple keys to this text and a couple things that we'll focus on. The first is Dewey's going to explore kind of this overarching tension in educational practice between what he calls traditional and progressive approaches to education. And I'm going to talk about that in more depth in the next couple slides, so I'll bracket that for now. And he's going to be aiming to really develop in this text a philosophy of experience for application in education. And by that, I mean, he's trying to think about, okay, if we're looking for high quality educational experiences, that means we need to think critically about, what type of experiences are beneficial in our classrooms and as educators. And so he wants to examine that. What makes for a productive educational experience that leads to growth in our students? And so he's approaching that philosophically, but it has a lot of practical resonance as well. And I think one thing we're going to see from Dewey, kind of a key theme in his work, is that education is not something that is distinct from life, right? Education is a fundamental part of life. It's a social, interactive process, not merely preparation for life down the line. It's a key aspect of life right now for our students in our classrooms as kind of social settings and communities of their own. So that's something we'll see, kind of a theme that we'll see reinforced throughout as well. Okay, so let's get to the first theme here that I talked about, this notion of traditional and progressive education. I have a selected history here. So this is a focus of chapter 1 of Experience in Education. And so Dewey writes, the history of educational theory is marked by opposition between the idea that education is development from within and that it's formation from without, that it is based upon natural endowments, and that education is a process of overcoming natural inclination and substituting in its place habits acquired under external pressure. So basically, what Dewey is getting at here is kind of this overarching tension. So if we're asking ourselves the question, what is the aim or the purpose of education? Well, there are at least two different answers we can give to that, one under the traditional model and one under the progressive model. So to give you a couple examples, and then we'll go into a specific breakdown of these conceptions of education. We can take, for example, historically, the work of Plato, obviously a famous philosopher, one of the most famous philosophers, right? But who also writes actually quite a bit on education in his text, The Laws and the Republic. And for Plato, who's kind of what we call for Dewey a traditional model educator, children's education must be really rigidly controlled, rigidly scheduled, and basically used fundamentally to continue the traditions of the adult world. So basically, the function of education is to introduce children to key traditions of society and continue those traditions going without change. So it's very much an aspect in which the child is passive, being educated by the adult for continuing key traditions. Now, by contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's text Emile, published originally in 1762, is a good historical example, and kind of maybe one of the first historical examples, of something we call progressive education, which is really very different than traditional education. It's actually eschews education merely for continuing traditions and reinforcing the norms of society. And actually, by contrast, really kind of talks about children playing a much more active role in their education, one in which they are interacting actively with their environment, with their world, with problems as they find and discover them. And really learning just is that process of children working through organic problems that they face in their world, in their society, in their classroom, right? So it's really opposed to the tradition for tradition's sake model. Now, I have character counts here, and I use this as just a contemporary example. I think some might argue certain forms of character education kind of fall along more of a traditional model. And I don't mean that in a negative or positive sense. I mean in just in a descriptive sense. So for example, character counts, a kind of national character education program, is one thing where it has kind of key character traits or virtues, right, that you know, in our society we think are important to instill in children. And the program is kind of really based around the idea of socializing children to those important values and virtues. So it's kind of adopting a traditional model in that way. So those are a couple historical examples of what Dewey means by this. But let's go to a closer look on breaking the models down. So here I have kind of a breakdown of the traditional and progressive model, kind of just opposing them here. So Dewey, again, he's highlighting this tension between these two models as kind of the fundamental tension in the history of education. So the traditional model aiming to prepare the young for future responsibilities and success in life. So education is very future directed, not present directed. It's really about introducing children to already organized and established bodies of knowledge and having them retain and understand those. And then, you know, ultimately the stance of students in the traditional model is one of being receptive to the information they're being given, being obedient, right? So being relatively passive in the process. Whereas progressive learning for Dewey is actually quite different in the sense that it's learning through experience, you know, present experience, not just future directed goals, problem solving, and acts of individual expression and interest by the students themselves. So students are much more active and involved in this process. Now, one thing I love about Dewey, and I think Experience in Education is a particularly good text to read because as far as Dewey goes, it's one of the more accessible works. But he's not a dichotomous or either or thinker. So he's not in this, you know, taking a stance and saying, you know, progressive education is the only way to go or traditional education is the only way to go. He's actually saying, look, both approaches have some value. And it's not enough just to reject one and go to the opposite, right? We actually need to think about how can we get value from both of these traditions, not just rejecting one and going to the other. And this is what we get with his question that he poses here. So he's basically saying, how shall the young become acquainted with the past, to traditions, in such a way that that acquaintance is also a potent agent in appreciation of the living present? And I think probably many of us can relate to that in our own teaching practice, I would imagine, right? How do we introduce children to traditional ideas, knowledge, established bodies of knowledge in a way that's vital and engaging for them, such as they can adapt it and really have it feel real and vital to them? And so that's what Dewey is thinking about too. And he says in order to answer that question, we need an adequate conception of educational experience to guide us as educators. So that's the problem, and the discussion of educational experience is coming out of that, trying to answer that tension and answer that question. So let's go forward a bit and think about and see what he says about educational experience. So here we have kind of the first key concept, and this is probably the most technical part of the presentation tonight. These two concepts they're important, but we won't, you know, belabor them either. But basically, the first key concept for Dewey is what he calls, you know, the experiential continuum, or the continuity of experience. And basically, the principle is simply put, every experience both takes up something from those which have gone before and modifies in some way the quality of those which come after. And, you know, basically, I was reflecting on this statement, and I was, you know, I came upon this quote book that I have. There's this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. The quote is, "A mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions." And I think that kind of captures this notion of continuity of experience really well. And basically, it's this, that every experience, including educational experience, is both influenced by our past, so things we're bringing to that experience, right? And in turn, that learning experience or experience in life influences everything that comes after it, basically. So you can't walk through the same door twice. Once we have an experience, right, where we look at what comes after that slightly differently, sometimes majorly differently, and that present experience is influenced by our past as well. So that's kind of the first principle. So given that, Dewey says, it's the business of the educator. It's our job as educators, right? And I see someone saying that they had that quote in their high school classroom for a long time. So that's great, Kevin. I'm glad that you relate to that as well. It's the business of the educator to help organize the conditions of experience and education such that they lead to growth, right? Growth is a key term for Dewey, and growth just is an educative experience, as opposed to miseducative experiences that hinder our growth as students and learners. And so what Dewey is thinking about here is basically, how do we create growth in our students? And let me drill down on this a little bit more, because I think he means something very specific by this, and it's a pretty important point. So for Dewey, all experiences that could make us grow are not created equal, basically. Some forms of experience, educational experience, open me up to continued learning, and some close me off to continued learning. And really what Dewey is thinking about here is basically the formation of certain habits and dispositions that open us up to continue to learn, or by contrast, shut us down and prevent us from learning in the future. So here's an example of what I mean by that. So we can think about learning through rote instruction and rote memorization, or learning through authentic problem solving. Now, in both cases, I might grow in the sense of learning something. So through rote memorization, I might memorize some set of facts, right, or dates or data. And through authentic problem solving, encountering a experiment that I don't know the answer to and trying to work through it to get an answer, I could learn something. What Dewey's interested in is those types of experiences and what types of habits and dispositions they set up. So in the first case, rote memorization, I might learn something, but Dewey also thinks that model might be something that ultimately might be miseducative, in the sense that I don't take from that a disposition to be necessarily curious or question or taking initiative in my own learning. I'm very passive. I'm just receiving the information. I memorize it or I don't. Whereas authentic problem solving, what type of dispositions am I setting up there? Well, I'm setting up dispositions to take initiative, to question, to problem solve, to possibly fail, but come back to the problem and try a different solution. Dewey thinks that's setting up habits and dispositions that put me in good stead to continue to grow in the future. And that's what he means by this last quote. Does the form of growth that we're thinking about create conditions for further growth in the future? Or does it set up conditions that shut us off, right, from the occasions, stimuli, and opportunities for growth in new directions? So part of what we can think about as educators here then is not only is there certain data or information our students are getting, but what type of dispositions or habits are we creating in our students in the way that we're educating? And that's what Dewey's pointing to here. So let's go to the next slide when we think about how we can think about structuring our experiences to create these types of dispositions. So here's our second kind of key concept. So, and I actually just want to note here too that there's one of our community members here noting this progressive approach. Kids being taught in math not only just show me how you get the answer, but show me multiple ways to get to the answer. So requiring them to be active in the process and problem solve. So that's a good kind of practical example of what Dewey's talking about. So the second aspect, if we know that growth is important, so how should we think about structuring our classrooms and our work with students to achieve growth? And there's no kind of one-time solution here, right? That we can map onto every experience or every class or every student. But Dewey gives us, I think, a nice framework to think about the conditions of an educational experience. And he divides it in two. He talks about objective conditions and internal conditions. So objective conditions, and just to say, these are present in every learning experience that we have or that we cultivate as educators. The objective conditions, broadly construed, are the learning environment, maybe the classroom, the resources being used, established bodies of knowledge that are at play, and the educational resources that are at play in the lesson or in the activity or in the problem that we're setting up. And the internal conditions are within the students' needs, their interests, their capacities, their attitudes. Both of those conditions are present in our educational experiences. So the key insight for Dewey is that, in order to foster educational growth, we need to take both of those conditions robustly into account, right? That we need to focus both on the learning environment and the needs and attitudes and interests of the student. And not only take them into account, but also think about their interaction, right? And that's a continual balance. That's what makes teaching such a creative act, right? Is that that balance is unique for each class, each group of students, each student that we work with, right? And so there's, we have to rely on our previous experience. We have to rely on intimate knowledge of our students. We have to rely on, our past knowledge and what has worked well in the classroom. There's all kinds of factors that we need to take into account in that interaction. But Dewey notes that the problem with traditional education, insofar it has problems, was not that it was bad in itself, or it's bad to focus on traditions, right, or previous bodies of knowledge or virtues that we think are important. It's that it focused almost exclusively on the objective conditions. So introducing established bodies of knowledge and not focusing on the internal conditions, students' needs, interests, capacities, and attitudes. Conversely, progressive education threatens to go all the way to the internal side and not focus on the objective. So again, we see Dewey as saying, look, both are key, right? It's about the interaction, not being dichotomous, but thinking about both of these aspects in our educational practice. So let's go to the next slide if we can. So I just wanted to kind of, as we're departing Dewey, this famous quote from Dewey: education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. And I think that, this is one of the key insights we get from Dewey, is that, oftentimes, it's easy for us to think of school as this separate institution where students go to learn and then, they leave, they go back home. It's kind of this separate aspect of their life from kind of the rest of their life and social experience. But Dewey thinks of education and learning as kind of part of the social whole. That, when we think about education, we're not just preparing students for what they're going to do once they graduate or once they get done with their grade. Education is life itself. Like the classroom is a vital part of what it means to be alive, right? And so we should think of it in this active social way, right? And I think that's something that kind of helps us make a shift in thinking about, the social conditions of the school, the social conditions of learning, as not separate, but actually a key part of life itself. And dialogue, as we're going to see going forward, kind of sets the foundation for us in this regard, and that it's a medium both for adult guidance and also to activate student engagement and problem solving. And I think that one of our community members here, Daniel, talks about issues of apathy that we experience in our students. And look, I hear you, right? I've experienced that in my classrooms, plenty of classrooms, and there's no magical solution, right, to that. Right? There's a lot of factors that lead into that. But I think one of the things that Dewey is going to note is, if we can engage students in authentic problem solving, right? If we can get students that are kind of lead to organic problems for students, that's going to be our best way to engage them as learners. That it's not something that's detached from their life. It's not something that is useful only insofar for a future career or for a grade, but something that's of vital importance and significance to their own lives. And that there's lots of ways we can get to that point, right? But I think that's what Dewey's trying to point us to. So I think he hears you on that.
And so, Michael, let me maybe even put a finer point on that and extend what you just said. You made the connection that I was thinking with Daniel's comment as well. And a comment actually that came out earlier from Christy, which is, this is actually really hard. It's messy, hard work. There are a lot of obstacles that come forth, but it sounds like what you're suggesting is that dialogue as an approach, as a skill, as a habit, as a exercise, philosophical dialogue helps address some of those issues. That the dialogue is in fact one of the solutions. If not the magic pill, it certainly is something that can lead to that.
I think that's really well said, Andy. And I think in my experience, and it's something that I've had just as a practicing educator. It's something I've had a lot of success with students, really of all different kinds. From across the country, different socioeconomic status, different background, different interests, different subjects. Where I think if I using it as a way to kind of draw students out and presenting a problem as, and we're going to see this with Paulo Freire coming up. Look, we have a problem here. There's things we know about it, and I see Ashley's comment here too about the use of kind of a traditional approach. So there are things we know, but there's lots of things we don't know about it, right? So posing something as an authentic question, an authentic problem, and saying, you know, we need to solve this together. We need to think about this together. We need to question this together. Even that stance sometimes can draw students out. And it's not automatic sometimes, right? I mean, you know, sometimes it is actually, but sometimes it takes students kind of a while to get used to that idea of playing that role. But I have had a lot of success with kind of taking a more dialogic approach, just that really kind of whatever grade level I'm working with, that's a fundamental aspect of my practice.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure. So let's take a look at Paulo Freire's work, kind of our second conceptual resource here. And if Dewey is giving us some, you know, philosophy of education conceptual resources to think about how to structure educational experience and involve students as active participants and dialogue, kind of a way we're going to talk about the going forward, Freire is talking about dialogue more directly, but he's really kind of giving us a picture of the ethics and politics of education. So a foundational text, and if you haven't read this, I really highly recommend it, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. You know, Freire is developing this text largely from his work in the field in Brazil in the 1950s and 60s with field workers, farm laborers, basically on practices of literacy. So he's dealing with a population that is largely politically disenfranchised and largely illiterate. And Dewey's question, what he's struggling with, is how do I engage with these populations around literacy in a way that does not reinforce oppression, but empowers them, humanizes them? How do I do that, right? And so Pedagogy of the Oppressed is basically an attempt to answer that question. And so he says, this book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. And in this quote, I think we start to see a turn towards a tradition that Freire was really instrumental in founding, called critical pedagogy. And basically, this is something that we don't get from Dewey, but we do get from Freire, in that teaching and learning are ethical and political acts, you know, whether we want them to be or not. And I don't mean that in the sense of being Republican or Democrat, you know, political. I mean in the sense that they have a bearing on power, they have a bearing on humanization, they have a bearing on oppression, right? And they have a bearing potentially on helping students to develop a critical consciousness about who they are as people, the problems they're facing, how they can approach them, right? Or conversely, making students blind to those issues and increasing kind of problematic power dynamics. And Freire is really interested in that aspect. That's what he calls it a critical pedagogy. So let's move forward a bit to look at some of Freire's key concepts and mapping this out. So perhaps one of, if not the key insight coming out of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and one that's been adopted in theory, and you see it written on just hundreds of times over, is this notion of education as narration, or what Freire calls banking education. So let's read this quote here. Education in the banking model becomes an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. This is the banking concept of education, in which the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filling, and storing the deposits. So Dewey here is talking about this banking concept of education as a very, very common method, right? Both within and beyond classrooms. And basically, this is one in which the student is very passive, the teacher is active, and notice the conception of knowledge that's at play in this notion of education. It's a conception of knowledge as very static, as already formed, already in place, and simply can be passed over and given to someone else, right? That's key here. So let's go to the next slide and think about the implications of this a bit more. So what Freire points out is that, and Ashley's noting here, that depositing is a very traditional approach. I think that's a really interesting connection to draw, that there certainly are salient connections there to be made. So banking education mirrors practices of oppression for Freire in his work with these field workers. He says the more students work at storing these deposits that are entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of the world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. So let's think about this a little bit. So we have an educational practice that's very common. Any of us who've been, we're teachers, but have been obviously educated ourselves, have been taught, have probably experienced this form, right? Maybe even exclusively, like in certain experiences. And Dewey is saying, I keep on getting the name mixed up, but Freire is saying, right, that not only is this education practice, but it's one that reinforces a passivity, a docility, right, and a lack of questioning, right, in students that can make it quite convenient for oppressive practices to continue. One in which we're willing to accept political realities and be passive, as opposed to question our world, question what's right, what is important for our communities, what we should be thinking about, right? And so Freire is very critical of the banking concept for both the conception of knowledge that it sets up and the relationship it sets up between teacher and student, right? And the political implications that has. So let's see next what Freire thinks we should be aiming for in our educational practices, given those problems. So this is where two concepts become really key for us, one of them being dialogue. So as opposed to kind of this static model of knowledge, Freire has a very different understanding of what knowledge is. Knowledge emerges through praxis, right? And by praxis, Freire means action and reflection upon one's world in order to transform it. So we learn, right? We gain knowledge, right? Not simply by receiving it in this kind of stagnant, passive way, but it comes through playing a role in identifying problems in our own lives, in our own societies, our own communities, our own classrooms, working through them, developing solutions with others, right? And so it's a much more active process, right? Both reflection and action combined together, this reciprocal process. And this is how Freire describes it. So knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless and patient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. That's just another way of saying kind of what I was trying to capture there. And dialogue plays a vital role in the development of this knowledge. And practically speaking, when Freire was doing his educational work in the field, it wasn't going and giving a textbook on literacy and working through it and saying, here's what you need to know, right? It was actually kind of dialoguing with groups. I call these culture circles, right? About terms that were important to those groups. And then, from those that established importance or, terms that weren't understood, right? Thinking about developing lessons of literacy from those problems, right? From those inquiries, from the interests of the group he was working with, right? And so for him, that was an element of empowering, right? Kind of, and humanizing their concerns and their interests. And he captures that process this way. He says, through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist, and a new term emerges. Teacher-student with student-teachers. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. People teach each other, mediated by the world, by the cognizable objects which in banking education are simply owned by the teacher, right? So we have a very different relationship taken on here, right? And very different roles taken on by the teacher and the student, right? And we have a very different conception of knowledge, not one that's static and inert, right? But one that's formed in relationship between the teachers and the students. And just to talk about how practical this can be, in my university classes here at California State University, pretty much the first day of every class I teach, I talk about this model. And one of the first lessons I try and get across to my students, really in an effort to make them see the classroom as a community, is, look, I'm coming into this classroom with expertise and knowledge and a background that allows me to be here. You are coming to this classroom with expertise and knowledge and background that I don't possess either, and life experience relating to our topic. So I'm teaching professional ethics as one class this semester, for example. And what I try and show them is, like, look, knowledge on the one hand could be considered something that I just have and I can deliver to you. Or by contrast, actually, what we're going to learn here is going to be actually at the intersection of my expertise and what I know and what you know and your experiences, and bringing those things together. And that's really the ideal. And that's a very Freirean notion of what learning is. But I find this really a key to how I think about educational practice in my classroom. So with that, let's go to our next slide. Just to, at this point, maybe to pause, right? I know I've been talking at you quite a bit. I'm wondering, I have two questions here for you. I mean, one, are there similarities or points of convergence that you see in the work of Dewey and Freire? First of all, maybe let's start with that question. Anybody see any important points of convergence or intersections?
So we're going to give folks a moment to type their answers in, Michael, and you can imagine all the fingers being poised across the country, getting ready to frantically type their answers in. Ashley, you say yes. I'd love to hear an example. But one thing I think you're doing tonight is inviting us to step out of the sort of myopic grind of teaching, which is very, very present tense, very, oftentimes driven by what the standards are, keeping pace with, what's happening. But as people answer this question, and please, again, for the audience, please type your thoughts into the chat box to the two questions that Michael has on the screen. Michael, it also strikes me that we are imagining a social dynamic in that classroom where the students also imagine something different. So it's not just teachers being aware of this, but you have to make sure that the kids know this is the approach you're taking. Otherwise, they're confused by what you expect of them.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, that's a great point, Andy, because I think that's something that Freire talks about too. It's not, the nature of oppression, right? At least in some cases, is that someone might not understand, right? The nature of that oppression, and that they are being oppressed in certain senses, right? And so for him, he's talking about that. That's why the banking model is so effective for an oppressive society, as he's seeing it deployed in his discussion, because it actually leads to a passivity, a lack of questioning. So it can't just be, let's start dialoguing. It has to be, well, why would we want to engage in dialogue? Like, right. Why would that be important for us? And so I'm seeing a couple answers coming in here. Both care to make kids active in the process. Banking model being very similar to the traditional approach that Dewey's identifying. I think there definitely are similarities. They both propose that the classroom and teachers move beyond the box. Yep, stepping away from the tradition that the teacher knows everything and offering students opportunity to be active. The power of students learning from experience. Yep. So yeah, I think these are all kind of highlighting some pretty interesting connections for sure. Yeah, the active passive distinction too. Go ahead, Andy. You say something?
Yeah, I think Raina just underscored the point that we were just making with each other, which is that oftentimes, she says I'm going to say often, students don't understand they don't understand that they're an actor in this play, right? That they do have to talk and discover, and that they are an active participant.
Right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think actually, and actually, I just want to look at this last comment from John. The ultimate buy-in for students is knowing that they have a voice in the matter. Often oppression boils down to muting the voice of the oppressed. And I think that notion of muting the voice is pretty key, and that their participation is valid. So those are really interesting comments. Thank you for the feedback. I'm thinking actually maybe we could move forward, because this second question I think I'm gonna be able to get at in a moment in a different way. So now here's a little bit of a transition for us. So we're transitioning to dialogue and practice. So we've engaged a little bit with theory, with some important thinkers on this topic. Now let's think about what this might look like in practice. And so to start, I'm just going to say, here's how I'm kind of defining dialogue and how I define it in my practice. So a co-inquiry and co-exploration of a question, problem, or idea. Right? That's kind of the way I use dialogue. And I think of it both as an educational tool, right, on the one hand, but also as a civic and ethical imperative. And I'm gonna explain that in terms of the skills agency breakdown. So skills is aligning with the notion of it being an educational tool. So one benefit I think we get in whatever classroom that we're deploying dialogue in, as opposed to monologue or a monologic approach where I'm exclusively, say, talking at, right? Dialogue involves a lot of kind of meta skills, right? A lot of sub skills, where when we're engaging students in that way and students are engaging their peers and us in that way, right? It involves them taking the perspective of other students. It involves, if they're going to be doing it well, right? Listening, understanding where someone else is coming from and their experiences. So we also include empathy there. Learning how to listen, right? Learning how to reason in terms of hearing what someone's saying, taking it in, analyzing, responding to it. And those are all practices that, again, they don't come on the first day of dialogic practice. They're skills that we need to build in and reinforce over the course of a year, a semester, whatever time we have, right? I think you can always do dialogue better, right? And I think another way to put this, and what I talk about, with teachers quite a bit, is think about all the social emotional skills that are built in there, right? That happen in a dialogue-based lesson, right? Where you're thinking about listening, perspective taking, hearing what someone is saying, right? And not just shutting them down. There's lots of social emotional skills which are becoming increasingly important, even in educational requirements in schools. I know that's definitely the case here in Bakersfield in our schools. There's a lot of social attention to social emotional learning now. But also, in addition to the skills, right, there's this notion of the civic and ethical imperative, so agency. And this is where I think Freire is really key, but so is Dewey. With teacher guidance, dialogue gives children a much more active and engaged role in the classroom. So there's a respect that's happening here. It's choosing to engage children as ethical and social, civically engaged persons. All right, so we're giving them a stake in the problem of the classroom or the problem of the school or of society, right? We're asking them to think about it, for them to help us think about it too. And I think that move in our pedagogy alone can be really, really empowering and important for children. I think honestly, if I was to boil down my educational practice and what I think is what I've been able to do that's been most impactful is probably taking that stance in my teaching. And I think helping to change the self-concept of students to one of, I have a stake in this. What I say matters. What I do matters. There's a question here from Jeffrey about what about if we see students that are only on an itinerant basis, right? A few lessons here and there. Building a sense of trust and community in such a small time is challenging. And I think that's true, and I think that, I think I want to come back to that question. And I think maybe once we look at some of the lessons in the latter half, I'm hoping that question will be raised again, and let's see if it answers some of that. If not, let's talk about it as a problem to consider together. So moving on from there, here's the question. So what are some strategies and activities you use in your own classrooms to catalyze and incorporate dialogue? And in answering this question, I want you to think about the question that our friend just raised about your classrooms, but also what if you're only seeing students a couple times? Are there things that you think have been effective even when you've only had a short amount of time with students? If not, don't feel obliged to answer that, but just if you do have insight, please share that as well, because that might be helpful to our friend who raised that question.
This will give you a chance to take a sip of water, Michael, catch your breath. Let folks respond to this question in the chat box. It's well, there's Trevor. Trevor offers a Socratic seminar, brainstorming, social contract, project-based learning. Round robin peer review, says Jennifer.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, Raina, and I really think that turn and talk and paired share. I think, Raina, I think that's a really important point to bring out, which is that the work that all of you do doesn't just happen in the confines of 48 minutes and a four-wall classroom, but you do see kids all day, all the time, in the hallways, in the lunchroom, on the bus. You're taking field trips, after school activities. So, yeah, those are all good examples of where that might happen.
Yeah, I think there's a number of really good suggestions there. Really a wealth of actually of good options. Um, a couple people have brought up this notion too that I think I want to highlight, this notion of establishing trust. And so I think both in the itinerant case, but then also in the longstanding case, maybe, I think there's no right single answer we can give, right? But it's a notion of, what are ways we can build in trust to brief interactions or longer interactions. If we have, a longer amount of time with students, maybe we have the luxury of having more opportunity to do that. But how can we engage children, give them a voice, and make them trust that we're actually going to be listening when they engage in dialogue with us and with the class? So I think there's lots of ways we can get at that. Maybe some of what we'll talk about here in the next couple activities, we'll stoke some additional ideas for that too. So let's move forward a little bit. So I'm going to give two broad forms of application in the classroom. The first is going to be dialogue in children's literature. But again, as I say, I think the way I'm talking about framing these approaches are, I think, very adaptable. In fact, I know they are just from experience and from working with lots of teachers. So feel free to reframe and adapt these as you see fit, right? These are things that, hopefully will be useful for you, but they're not set in stone, so to speak. So the prompt we're thinking about is children's literature, but we could also be thinking about games or artwork or vignettes, which we'll talk about in a moment, focusing on a problem or an issue that we've encountered in the school or the classroom. There's lots of different prompts we could use. And then there's some key elements of the process that in terms of using children's literature here, but again, in an adaptable sense as well. First element, co-inquiry. We talked about this, but the notion that we need to approach this process in a way in which authority over content, questions, and the shape of the dialogue is shared. That doesn't mean as a teacher I have no role. It means I'm not the only one determining those elements, right? And so that requires relinquishing some control. And sometimes that can be scary, right? We can kind of feel like we're in no person's land, right? But I think that's a really important aspect of this that takes practice. Related to that, students and teachers are active as opposed to passive participants. And then to facilitate that, and our next slide is going to get this even more closely, the notice of using open, authentic questioning in addition to comprehension questioning. So we want to ask questions to make sure, particularly in the case of working with young children, very young children, comprehension and understanding. This is important for any students, but are students understanding what's at issue, what the story is about, what we're focusing on, but then also using a lot of open, authentic questioning to kind of stimulate dialogue. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. And then, providing, as the educator, or the business of the educator, as Dewey would put it, providing encouragement, giving meaningful, specific feedback to help move the dialogue along. And one way I frame this oftentimes in kind of teacher training and work is, being the connective tissue in the dialogue. Particularly when working with young kids, they have no shortage of ideas and questions. That's not the problem. That is not a problem at all. Sometimes the issue is the ability to link up to other comments and ideas that are being put forward. And so one of the things we can do as facilitators is we can help connect those comments up. I hear you saying this. Does anybody else agree with that? I hear that this is how you're describing the experience. Has anybody else experienced that way? We can kind of interject sometimes these summarizing, reframing comments to help create the connective tissue in the dialogue until children can take on more of that role themselves. So that's part of what we can do. And then summing up, and that could be something as simple as a culminating question, a comment on the progress that the group made, like here's where we started and here's where we finished, and maybe ask the students to talk about that, a preface to your next dialogue, or introducing an extension activity. And we'll talk about a few of those examples going forward here. So here's what I mean by open questioning. So an open question is a question for meaningful inquiry that can have multiple competing answers determined by the class, as opposed to a leading question, right? One where the answer is not really up for debate. We know exactly what we want to hear. So an open question is one where we really don't know what the exact answer is, right? And so I give a couple questions here. What do you like most about? What would you do if? Tell me about a time that. There's all kinds of different responses that we could get from that from our students, right? And in terms of facilitation, I've already talked about this a bit in terms of, you know, reframing, summarizing, creating connections. And I give you some on the bottom right there, some kind of facilitation moves, some questions that you might use to link up and be that connective tissue. But one thing I want to think about too is, you know, facilitating here, and I think in creating dialogues, one of the things that we can get frustrated by or maybe misunderstand is it's really not necessarily about the conclusion or the answer. It's, you know, kind of dialogue can kind of mirror philosophy in this way, that actually the process of questioning, the process of listening, the process of thinking through possibilities and discovering that there are more possibilities than you initially considered, that process in and of itself is a valuable educational experience, both in the self-concept way, in terms of students seeing themselves as active and contributing to that process, but also in terms of, you know, thinking about knowledge as an interactive process, not something that necessarily has a finite limit and is done at the end of every class. Now, that being said, a sense of progress can also be important too. That's why that summarizing element that I talked about before can be really important, where you take the last 5-10 minutes to say, okay, you know, where did we start and where are we ending? How can we build on this? Does anybody else have any questions that we didn't consider that we might consider the next time? So a sense of kind of bringing some resolution, but also a resolution with the possibility for continuation. So let's move forward a bit. So here's just a few, and there really are a plethora of children's literature that we could use if we were inclined to use children's literature with our students. And actually, I like to use children's literature even sometimes with my university students. I think it's kind of sometimes it's actually always fun and something that's kind of out of the ordinary for them, and something that can actually lead to some pretty fascinating conversations. But I want to note a couple things here. One, I think on an earlier slide, my bio slide, there was a text that myself and Jenna Morlone published in 2016 called Philosophy and Education, Questioning and Dialogue in K-12 schools. And that text has a number of lesson plans and ideas for children's literature, but really, literally K through 12. So we have all kinds of different lesson plans and ideas there that might be of interest to you to think about and use. The Plato website has a ton of free resources as well. And then also Tom Wartenberg, who's a pretty prominent practitioner of pre-college philosophy, he has a website called Teaching Children Philosophy that has all kinds of free children's literature modules that have lesson plans about how to cultivate dialogue, what the themes are, what questions you might use. So those are some resources to fall back on if you're interested in this. But just these 4 books here, you know, Frog and Toad Together, I see somebody's used that and they like that one quite a bit. You know, there's a number of themes here, you know, friendship, courage, you know, self-control, illusion versus reality, all kinds of interesting themes you could discuss with students. The Big Orange Splot I used last week, had a fantastic conversation with 3rd graders about the tension sometimes between individuality, wanting to be your own person, versus the pressures to conform and being part of a community. So that was an interesting one. And Hey Little Ant, I know one of the readings I gave you was an article I published with a few other educators and professors a few years back that really focuses on empathy and issues of peer pressure and perspective taking. And the article was about how to use that with kindergarten students. So that might be it's a short read. It might be an interesting read for you if you're interested in that. And the Rainbow Fish, another classic one that focuses on issues of sharing, friendship, inclusion and exclusion of peers, kind of tension that comes up with that. So there's just a few examples of children's literature you might consider. So here's just a kind of a brief snapshot of another book, one that is kind of a longtime favorite of mine, called Frederick by Leah Leone. And Frederick is about a group of field mice. And let's go to the next slide, and I'll start to tell you some of the story in a condensed form. So basically, Frederick is the one on the left here with his eyes shut. Looks like he's daydreaming a bit or taking a snooze. So basically, Frederick is hanging out while all the other field mice are gathering food for the upcoming winter. right? So he's kind of hanging out there. And the field mice are basically saying, Frederick, aren't you going to help us? We're gathering this food for the winter. It's going to be cold. We're going to be hungry. And Frederick's saying, yeah, that's good, right? But I'm gathering ideas. I'm gathering colors for the cold winter days. He's saying things like that. And let's go on to the next slide. So here in this scene, we're deep into the winter. The food is almost all gone. The mice are cold, they're hungry, and they say, Frederick, now what about those stories and those ideas and those colors you were gathering? And Frederick says, sit back and listen for a minute. And he reads this or recites this beautiful poem about the seasons and colors and warmth and food. And what you see are the mice kind of engaging in imagination of the colors that he's reciting, the beautiful spring colors. And children, first of all, kind of love this book, in my experience. But it also, I think, raises some possibilities for some interesting open questions. And so that's the next slide here. Is I have a question for you about this. I have a few ideas here, but I'm wondering if this story, and again, granted, very condensed form, are there some open questions that could be raised with the story of Frederick? Just again, in this condensed version that you see or that are catalyzed for you based on this overview. So Ginger talks about an open question about communism. That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard that connection before for sure. Socialism.
Amelia's seeing the less cutthroat version, the G-rated version of Grasshopper and Ant.
Mm-hmm.
What other themes do any of you see emerge from the story of Frederick?
Cooperation of varying amounts. Okay, good. I like Bretta's. You can't eat colors. This guy should have helped out, and there would have been more food. Yeah, that's great, Bretta. And I've heard actually some students articulate that same idea. And then also the idea of questions, of ideas, and creativity being useful as other resources. So, what kind of resources are important for our community? That's a really interesting take. Great. Everyone has a gift to offer a community. Good. Art versus labor. Interesting. Yeah, these are really great connections. I mean, even in that short, condensed version. So let's move forward to the next slide, Andy. So here's a couple open questions that I've used. So one is about fairness. So when he's not helping, is he being fair? Is he being fair to his fellow mice? And not only that, what does it look like to be fair? Right, kind of generalizing from that question. What does it mean to be fair? Should Frederick's fellow mice share with him during the winter, even though he didn't gather any other food? Why or why not? So again, like an ethical question and a social emotional question. Do the mice have a community, and what makes for a good community? So part of this connects to the question that some of our friends were raising about this notion of different types of resources that might be valuable for a community. You can have a really fascinating conversation about that. But also, there's really good possibilities for applying this out of the story to your own classroom in your school. So do the mice have a community? Is this classroom a community? Is this school a community? And if so, what are the foundations for that? What makes for a community, or what makes for a good community? So there's lots of really interesting open extensions that could come there. And I've had some fascinating conversations on that regard. And then honestly, a really cool just conceptual analysis that's come out quite a bit with students with the story is Frederick playing or is he working? How are the two different? And so that's another thing is art work, right? Or is it something else? And so how do we distinguish those two activities, right? Are they forms of labor, or are they really different things, right? So that's just an interesting kind of side note I'd add there as well. So if you were to set up a kind of a format or a dialogue plan, here's one way you might do it, and this is just suggested. Um, I have this kind of, I'll come back to this develop as a guide versus a blueprint idea. But basically, one thing I do, and this is something I use often, is themes. Okay, so after I'm reading a book, and those of us who don't want to use children's literature, we want to use something else, like a case study, or a news article, or another work of literature. I think you can still adapt this for your own use. What are the key concepts or ideas that might be relevant, in a dialogue on this work, on this piece of literature? What are some pre-reading questions I might use to develop participation, to activate prior knowledge, to gain interest from the students? What are a series of questions that would be important to introduce during the reading, right? Maybe I pause, maybe I don't read the story all the way through and then engage in discussion. I pause at certain points to introduce certain questions, both for comprehension and for dialogue. And then what are some questions or activities that I might want to introduce at the end, right? To kind of extend the themes and continue the dialogue going forward. And so I put here develop as a guide, not as a blueprint, because this is really an important distinction. I mean, a blueprint is something we want to follow exactly, but a guide is something that gives us inspiration, gives us information, but we can depart from it in various ways. We can depart slightly here and there. And so don't feel that in doing this, I have to rigidly keep to each of these elements. It might be that, halfway through a reading question or a pre-reading question, ideas are introduced that I did not anticipate at all, right? Questions are introduced from students that I did not anticipate at all. And that's a sign of success, right? That's actually can be a great thing. And that actually happens quite a bit. So my work last week with third graders, I was introducing this book, The Big Orange Splot, that I said dealt with themes of individuality versus community. But actually, a really interesting side conversation came from the third graders themselves, which was really on when do you become an adult? Because we ended up talking about when can you make your own decisions about how you want to design your own house, which is an aspect of the book. And that got into a discussion of, well, when do we become an adult? When do we become responsible? And that was something I did not have in any of my guide. I did not have that question listed. But because of the dialogical basis, right, it being open in that way, that was introduced by the students, and we were able to take that seriously. And that was an interesting thread of our conversation. So again, a guide, not a blueprint. So here's a second aspect. So we talked about children's literature. And those of you, again, who are working with young children, or you're working with high schoolers or middle schoolers, this activity in particular is, I think, immensely adaptable. You can really, and I'm going to give you both an early childhood version of this and a 5th and 6th middle school version of this, but that can easily be used with high schoolers. So a vignette is a short story account or episode designed to evoke dialogue. So it's a short story, that you would be writing, you would be developing. And here are the elements of effective vignettes. They are relevant to or rooted in lived experience. They have accessible language that our students can understand. They're designed to evoke dialogue regarding social, emotional, ethical, or civic values. They contain an authentic problem or dilemma or conflict to be addressed. So they're not something that's just giving a ready-made answer, but there's really something to be solved and figured out. And that connects to 5. It does not provide a clear resolution. Our students need to be engaged in answering or providing solutions, perspective-taking responses to the issue at hand. And I have on the right side of the slide here both an icon for Peach and for Seed. So Peach is for philosophical ethics in early childhood. Seed stands for social emotional ethics and democratic education. These are 2 education and research projects that I have co-founded. One in 2014 in Pennsylvania, and we've had extensions in Verona, Italy, and also in California. And SEED is an institute that myself and my colleague, Dr. Brittany Beck, have set up here in Bakersfield, where we work with classroom teachers to develop social emotional ethics and civic education programming in their classrooms. And so this vignette idea is informed by both of these projects, and we've had a lot of success with it, and we've actually also are actively doing research on this model now too. And I should mention too, the Peach model was also developed in collaboration with my co-founder Tuche Biarda Tunstemir. So she's also active in this project. I want to acknowledge my collaborators here as well. So let's move on to a couple of examples of, well, sorry, one more explanatory slide. Why do I think vignettes are an important tool for us to use for cultivating dialogue? Well, they allow us to attend to issues relevant to our students' lives, classrooms, and schools. The format is flexible and manipulable, so I can write a short story or account that really grapples with any issue or any value that I want to highlight. And also, oftentimes, doesn't need to be exclusively, but oftentimes I make students the main characters of the vignette. So not necessarily literally the students in that class, but if I'm working with a sixth grader, right, a sixth grade class, I would have students, maybe be middle school students, be the focus of the vignette. So it's they're the characters in the story to make it more relatable. And the focus of the vignettes can be, interpersonal, so a problem between two students, a problem within a classroom or a question for a classroom, or beyond the school, a societal issue that students need to engage with. So again, I really love the adaptability of this. So now let's go to look at a couple of examples. So here's one from the Peach Project called The New Kid in Class. This is written by me and Tuche Tunstemir. So Christina's family just moved to town. She is starting her first day at her new school. She doesn't know anyone in her school, and she feels shy and a little nervous. And after getting dropped off at school by her parents, Christina walks into her new class, and she sees some kids playing games in one corner of the room. In another corner of the room, she sees some kids drawing pictures of their favorite animals. Christina likes to play games and likes to draw, but she doesn't know anyone in class, and she's not sure what to do. So Christina decides to stand by herself in another corner of the room. Now, some of the kids in the class notice that Christina is standing by herself. And that's where the vignette ends. And I should note, this one in particular was for pre-kindergarten and kindergarten students, so younger early childhood students, right? So that's the vignette that's being introduced. Let's go to the next slide. And here's some questions and an extension activity that I set up around this vignette. So the questions we would be asking, we would be working with the class as a whole. So the first two, well, let's take the first one. How do you think Christina feels in class and why? So we're really asking kind of a question about perspective taking and emotion recognition there, kind of a social emotional skill set. Have you ever been new in class, camp, or a play group in which you didn't know anyone? And what did that feel like? Again, perspective taking and empathy type of question there. And then the last three questions, or the last two at least, are really about thinking about, what should the kids in the class do, if anything, for Christina? It's not saying, here's what they should do. It's asking the kids to perspective take, think about what she's experiencing, right? And then asking the kids to problem solve around it. What would they do if they were in those children's shoes? And having a conversation about the answers that they put forward. Now, given that we were dealing with young children in this case, right, and kind of children, and especially in the preschool and kindergarten, where there's developing their verbal skills and articulation skills, there was an extension activity that we came up with, and this is described on the right-hand side, and I'll show you some examples of it in a moment. But after the full group discussion, we broke into small groups, and we had them rotate through, and they'd be given a drawing panel, and one half of the panel had a drawing that illustrated the vignette, so Christina being new to class, and the other half was blank. And we asked the students we reviewed the story and then asked them to draw kind of the resolution, what they think should happen, right? And that activity, we have examples of that on the next slide. So let's go to that. And so we have on the top of the drawing, Christina on the left-hand corner and some students in the classroom. And then this was, preschool children drawing this. So, and as they were drawing the solution, we were talking to them about, what are you drawing, and what's happening here? And as they were describing that, we were transcribing it. We put kind of captions here to capture that. So the first one, I drew her a picture of a rainbow to make her feel better. And the second one, I made numbers for her to count, which is a really interesting kind of solution, right? Kind of creating numbers for her to count and be active. So part of what I want to point out in this is that, we have a vignette that's engaging with a pretty common problem for a preschooler or a kindergartner, being new, feeling isolated, right? Navigating peer relationships. That's really kind of an important thing in early childhood, not only, but definitely in early childhood as well. And then, thinking about, as Andy's question raised it very early on in our webinar tonight, you said you talk about K through 12, do we really mean that? And this is pre-K through 12. And yeah, I mean, this is a way in which really in this Peach project, we were really interested in how do we cultivate dialogue even with the youngest of kids, and not even as a finished product, but kind of instill those skill sets in, right? And this type of activity, I think it was one way to do that. We were able to dialogue with really young children and then bring those drawings back and talk about what they drew and why they drew it and go from there. So that's kind of an example that we've had some good success with. So what I think maybe would be good to do given our time is maybe skip ahead just a few slides to the creating and using vignettes, school and community aspect. So here we go. Yeah. So the one that we skipped over, which you can see is another example of an early childhood vignette. This one is one that was designed for 5th and 6th graders by my colleague, Dr. Brittany Beck, from the Civic Empowerment Project. And so this one, the vignette is called The Walk Out. And it's dealing with, whereas the first vignette we talked about was an interpersonal issue, this is a school and broader community issue. So you see the adaptability here. And the vignette, I'll read it to you here. So in response to the school shooting that happened in Parkland, Florida, several students at Zephyr Lane Elementary decided to participate in the National School Walkout that was scheduled to happen throughout the United States, initiated by actually young children, I should say too. The purpose of the school walkout is to encourage lawmakers to reduce gun violence and the number of guns in their community. Worried that the students may put themselves in danger by walking out of the school and that the learning of many students would be disrupted, the principal and vice principal decided to send a letter home to children and families to warn them that any students who participated in the school walkout would be suspended for 10 days. The students do not want to get in trouble with the school or with their families, but they feel they must stand up for what they think is right. So notice a couple things here. So we have a story that's written that's engaging with an actual problem, right? An organic problem in the school, in the community, right? So think about Freire and Dewey here, an authentic problem that we're looking to engage students around, right? One that's not distant and abstract, right? And also one that doesn't have a clear resolution. It ends without resolution. So we need students to think through this as a group about how we should approach this. And so on the next slide, here's some questions we might use to stimulate dialogue around this incident, right, or this vignette. For the students who want to walk out, what is their dilemma? So what is the dilemma in the first place, right? Perspective taking. How do the principal and vice principal feel? Why do they feel that way? So not just, if we're talking about this with students, them centering around what the students are thinking, but why are the principal and vice principal trying to prevent the walkout in the first place? What might be their motivation? If you were an elementary student at Zephyr Lane, what would you do and why? And are there times when it's okay to break a rule? Explain your thinking and provide an example so that a rule is being set, right? There's a tension with that rule. Is it okay to break a rule at all? Maybe not, maybe so. Like, what might be reasons for thinking one way or the other and discussing that? And so you can have, a fascinating conversation and really important, vital, present conversation through some of those questions, right? And listening to dialogue on any one of those. But then also thinking about an extension activity from this, and what Dr. Beck did with her students and her teachers was basically do a design thinking activity. So defining what the problem is, creating solutions, choosing the solution that we think will potentially work best, storyboarding that solution, and then developing a way to test that solution. And so the next couple of slides are going to give you a couple of examples of what this looked like in practice. So this again is from 5th and 6th grade students. So we have a storyboard on the one hand, right, of on the top left-hand corner, a incident with a gun, right, around a school. The student reacting to this by writing a letter to a politician, to a senator, delivering the letter, and then a solution coming about because of that letter and that activism that's taken. And you can actually see the letter that was developed by the student with her teacher and was sent to Dianne Feinstein. And I think what's cool about this is it's, you know, the dialogue aspect, but then also engaging children, right, as civically, you know, as participants in a civic process, in a political process, and also in taking an active role in responding to a problem that's in their community, in their school. And one of the things that, you know, you see with students is, I mean, the violence we see in schools that we have seen, right, can be really frightening for students. And as opposed to just passing over it and not talking about it, this vignette gives a way in this classroom to really think productively and creatively around an issue that the students were scared and concerned about, right? And so let's look at another project from a student. So the storyboard over here was quite different, right? There's a problem, someone attacking a school, people feeling scared and helpless. And the solution that the student drew up in this safe school was actually increasing security at the school, putting in metal detectors, right? Trying to prevent intruders. So again, kind of a different strategy, right? That the student was representing in this process. And all of these kind of came from that dialogue and that storyboarding process introduced through this vignette. So let's go to the next slide. So
Michael, we're just about out of time, and so we might, if you can summarize what I think this is probably your last slide. If you can summarize this as the extension, then I've got one last question for you.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. What I want to do here is just leave you with this activity, and one thing that I've found useful with a number of other teachers that I've worked with, collaborated with, is, you know, think about maybe as a value that you think is a really important one for considering in your classroom, or a problem. Maybe there's been issues with perspective taking or listening. Maybe there's been issues with you know, fairness. You know, maybe there's been issues with bullying. You know, maybe think about that, right? And then think about, you know, what is a way that I could present that in a vignette? Is there a short story I could capture or a problem I could represent that's not maybe calling out the individual students in question or something like that, but something we just want to explore as a class even, right? And try and draw one of those up, right? And I think, you know, try it out in your classroom. Maybe even if you don't have a bunch of time, maybe use it as a dialogue starter for the beginning of a class, or maybe even use it, you know, to map out an aspect of a lesson that you're already introducing in your classroom. And I think, you know, I've just seen a lot of really interesting applications of this. So I encourage you to try that out in your own practice.
Excellent. And Michael, I've got one last question for you as we wrap tonight's session up. It's really been a fantastic summary, and I think a very in-depth conversation around the points that you're making. But, you know, I started the conversation by asking you to affirm that this was appropriate for younger students. And so I'm actually going to flip that question on you and ask you, as a philosopher, as a PhD, as a academic, as a university level academic, a philosopher who has your own training in philosophy and your understanding of philosophy, share with me how you as an academic philosopher views this work. How is this doing philosophy?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question. The question's actually been great all night, very helpful. You know, so for me, I do philosophical work in prisons, K through 12 schools, community organizations, really kind of all over the map. I kind of think of myself as what you would call kind of a publicly engaged philosopher, and there's a reason for that. You know, and really, I think philosophy at its core, right, is about questioning, is about thinking about ideas and problems, you know, of community concern, and that's really what philosophy comes out of. And so, you know, anybody, right, you know, whether it's a senior citizen or a 5-year-old, has questions, right? Thinks about values, right? They might not be thinking like I'm doing philosophy right now, but they are asking philosophical questions, and I'm really interested, right, in the philosophical process, not just within the academy, but actually much more beyond it. And so doing philosophy is something that, you know, is really about, like I said, questioning and considering our values and problems that we encounter in daily life, as well as in the lessons we're teaching and in the curriculum that we're reviewing. So I think it's really, a much broader practice, and not one at all that is simply isolated to higher education or the work of scholars. And I say that as someone who has published a lot, right? But as someone who's actually really has worked extensively with a really broad amount of populations.
Excellent. Michael, thank you so much for leading tonight's conversation. I really appreciate your insights, and we all appreciate you pulling together these resources for us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the time. It's been a blast. So I hope it has been useful.
I would like to remind everyone, all of our participants, that tonight's session has been recorded, and it will be available for you to view and to go back and linger with probably within 48 hours or so. We've also made the PowerPoint available in your webinar landing page, so you can download that. And when I close tonight's room, you'll have a chance to complete an evaluation that gives you access to your certificate of attendance. We really do appreciate you spending all of your time with the work that we do at the National Humanities Center. On November 29th, I'd like to mention that we will be hosting a live talk from Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, most famous from the Pentagon Papers in the early 70s. While Seymour will be at the National Humanities Center, we'll also be streaming this live on YouTube. And so if you're interested in viewing that yourself, if you'd like to see the recording and share it with your students, or like to hear some of his perspective as an iconic journalist in now the digital age and the age of the world that we live in now, then please tune in for that. You can sign up for free using the center's YouTube channel. And I also hope to see many of you at our next webinar. We're scheduled for Tuesday, November 13th, to work with Rasha Kirakosian from Harvard University. Winter is coming, and what we'd like to do is spend 90 minutes really exploring the myths of the Game of Thrones. It's become such a ubiquitous program and sort of acknowledgement of a time period in all of our lives. And kids who watch this, what she's going to do is really pull out the what, the when, and the where of the real version, the real environment of Game of Thrones in terms of medieval history. So we hope to see you there. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful school day tomorrow. We'll see you next time with the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.